Good morning again. Welcome to our Adult Forum series. This week, our topic is grief, kind of in a more broad, general theme, but also one of our speakers today is going to break that down more specifically to grief during this time of COVID in the pandemic. I wanted to open us with a prayer. This is a prayer from Kate Braystrup's book, Beginner's Grace. It is a prayer of petition. Let us pray. Oh God, I offer the prayers of my heart for those who are suffering. I don't know their names. You know their names, and their sufferings are real to you. Let them become real to me. Let me know how to be with them. If they must suffer, may they know that they are not alone. May they be clothed with love, fed with love, warmed and protected by love. May they be held in your hands and blessed in your love. May the dead find their places in memory. May the wounded be healed. May the mourners be comforted. May the morning come when all may arise with joy. Amen. So I alluded earlier that we have two speakers today to double team y'all and tackle this topic of grief. Our first speaker is Jennifer Wilder, and she is going to be the speaker who kind of covers grief in more general terms. And then Jaylene, our very own Jaylene Whitehurst, will be breaking that down into more specific terms. So, Jennifer, come on up. Thank you and welcome.
Thank you. My name is Jennifer Wilder. I'm an LCSW in private practice. I've been in the mental health field since 1998, and I've been in private practice at Miller Psychiatry in Saltillo since 2011. Grief is a very important topic for me. As a therapist, I often encounter clients who are working their way through grief. Grief is a natural, necessary, and therapeutic reaction to loss. And we usually think of grief as sadness or sorrow, and it can be experienced for losses ranging from loss of employment, loss of pets, loss of status, loss of possessions. But usually when we talk about grief, it refers to the loss of loved ones, either through the loss of a relationship or through death. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross is well known for her theory of the 5 stages of grief from her 1969 book on death and dying. The stages she proposed are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. These stages were suggested as a foundation to help understand grief, but in the last 50 years, grief has been realized to be much more complex than just those 5 stages. And so now these are mainly seen as just a point of reference. For those who do experience these 5 stages, not everyone goes through all of them. And those who do go through all of them, they may not go through them in a linear order. For others, the stages are repeated until the grief is processed. The first stage, denial, when the loss doesn't seem real, or when the bereaved thinks that perhaps there's a mistake. They hope to find out the news that the death is incorrect. They hold on to that disbelief. Next is anger. When anger is felt during grief, it can be directed many places. They can direct the anger at themselves for surviving, anger at the deceased for leaving. Often the anger is directed at God for taking the loved one, or for allowing the death, or for not stopping it. Finding someone else to blame allows the bereaved to channel a righteous anger. Anger is often thought of as a surface level emotion, one that's a gatekeeper for the other emotions. It covers up emotions that seem more vulnerable, like sadness and pain. So anger is something that people sometimes feel more comfortable showing in public when they don't want to share their tears and show that they're vulnerable. Bargaining sometimes involves a request to God that want to make a deal or a compromise to get more time with the deceased. Depression is the stage most often thought of when people think of grief. That's where the sorrow the sadness and despair come in. That's not to be confused with clinical depression. Sadness and grief is completely normal, and it's a necessary part. The final stage, of course, is acceptance, when the emotions can stabilize. It's important to know that the only way through grief is to go through the emotions. You can't go around it. There's no easy way out. There's no way to skip it. When the grieving person stuffs the emotion down or finds ways to numb the pain or distract themselves from the sadness temporarily, those feelings will show up again whenever that distraction ends. It's human nature to want to avoid pain. So sometimes people will do things to distract themselves, like they'll work 90 hours a week to stay busy, they'll use substances to numb themselves, they'll sleep excessively. But typically when those things stop, the pain returns. Grief demands to be felt, so it keeps showing up. One phrase I hear often about grief is time heals all wounds, but I don't think it does. I think time just passes. It's what we do with that time that determines if the wound is healed. So if you're grieving, there are some important points for you to remember. There's no wrong or right way to grieve. There's no specific way to feel or behave after a loss, regardless of what your culture or society expects. As long as you're not hurting yourself, hurting someone else, or being destructive, any way that you naturally grieve is okay. So try to be accepting of your particular grieving style. And don't put pressure on yourself to conform to anyone else's preconceived notion of what grief is or what they think is best for you. What works well for one may have the exact opposite effect for the other. For instance, for some people, visiting the grave site can be very healing. They feel calmer, they feel closer to the deceased. For others, going to the cemetery may bring on desolation. They may feel very cold and maybe more upsetting. So in those situations, do what makes you feel better, not necessarily what people think that you should do. Often I hear clients share about families, members, or friends who expect them to be done grieving by a certain time. But every person has their own unique way of grieving and their own timeline. However, the first year after a loss is usually considered the hardest. That's when you have all the holidays, all the anniversaries. That's your first time through that without that person. That does not mean that the whole year is going to be hard, that the whole year will be filled with sorrow. It also doesn't mean the grieving is going to be over when the year is up. Often we want to help our friends or family members who are grieving, but we don't know how. So if you're wanting to support someone who is grieving, here are a few suggestions. Be mindful of platitudes, as they are rarely comforting. We often want to offer words to take the pain away because we want people to feel better. But in reality, there's very little we can say that does that. If someone is grieving the loss of someone very close to them, that pain's going to be there regardless of what words we come up with. So there are no magic words. So making statements like, this was God's will, can sometimes bring up anger toward God. Saying, she's in a better place now, suggests that here on earth with the bereaved wasn't a good enough place. Suggesting he would want you to be strong, may give the impression that showing their authentic emotion is shameful and weak. So think more about how you would feel when those things were said to you. Refrain from saying things like, I know how you feel. You may know how you felt in a similar situation. That doesn't mean that the grieving person feels the same way. For instance, if I lost my father, how I felt may be completely different from my friend who lost their father. They may have a lot of similarities, but our relationships are very unique. So being honest and saying, I don't know how you feel, but I care about you and I want to help. That's a good place to start. In the first week after a loss, so much is done for the person in grief while that person is in shock, which the shock helps get them through a multitude of things that have to be done. The purpose of emotional shock is to numb the pain, and when you numb that, when that emotion is numbed, you can do those necessary tasks. But at some point, those emotions are going to come back and the reality of loss hits. And that's when the person who is grieving really needs help. That's usually after the funeral and when other people have gone back to their own lives and have moved on. And that's when the person who is grieving is entering their phase of the most intense grief where they're going to need the most support. If you want to help someone who's grieving, propose specific and concrete suggestions instead of vague offers. Saying things like, can I go get groceries for you? Or I'm going to bring you dinner next Tuesday. Here in the South, we love to bring people food when they're grieving, often comfort food like fried chicken and mashed potatoes and pie. But it's so much more useful to offer something specific instead of saying, well, just let me know what I can do. Often when people are in that intense period of grief, they don't know what they need. And having to come up with something can be overwhelming, so often they don't ask, and they go through it alone. Another suggestion is to continue to check in on them long after the funeral. Invite them to dinner, send messages, call them, something just to say, how are you doing? And just letting them know you still care, you haven't forgotten them. Offer your presence, just letting yourself be there with them while they feel what they need to feel. Letting them know that you can handle their emotions and tears. This is called the ministry of presence or holding space. Basically, you're providing an opportunity for their emotions to be witnessed without judgment and without pressure. Some people find it really hard to simply be present during big emotions, but doing things like telling them not to cry or attempting to cheer them up tends to interrupt a necessary process. So listening and allowing them to express their feelings is a sacred process that honors their grief. Over the years, I've noticed that whenever there is no funeral or memorial service for the deceased, the family seems to have a harder time grieving. There are very few times in our society where raw emotion and expression of sorrow is embraced publicly. But a funeral service is one of those rare times. It's a time where we gather with loved ones, we share our pain, we cry, we support each other. And I think that's a really important piece in the grieving process that makes the loss seem like part of reality. And without it, the denial stage seems to linger. It doesn't have to be a formal or organized gathering like a funeral. It simply can be a gathering of friends, but something that says this is the start of our time to honor the person who has passed on. And it seems to be an initiator for the grieving process. So I'm going to let Jaylene Whitehurst come, and she's going to talk more about the challenges we're facing with that, grieving a pandemic.
Okay. Jennifer, thank you for laying the groundwork there. It is my hope that when we talk about grief in general and grief as we're being affected in the pandemic situation, that we can sort of open up the gate for dialogue and awareness. It is certainly too broad a topic for us to fully cover in a forum on a Sunday morning, but we can begin. A little bit about myself and my interest in grief. My personal interest in grief goes back to deaths that happened in my family when I was a very small child. And they affected me intensely. But as a child, I had no idea that that was affecting me. Looking back at struggles that I had, at struggles within my family, I'm aware of how we dealt with or didn't deal with grief, had lifelong consequences for me. And so as a therapist, and I am an LPC, semi-retired, but as a therapist, I notice how in people's struggles, almost always, I'm not going to say 100% of the time, but almost always, we could go back and identify a loss that happened somewhere along the way that was never dealt with, possibly never even acknowledged as a loss. The feelings weren't expressed, it wasn't honored, and as Jennifer mentioned, when those feelings are in there and they're not dealt with, they are going to ooze out. If you picture a boiler and the seams around a boiler, and pressure rises, and eventually there are going to be some fissures there, and there's going to be steam coming out. People are going to get hit, innocent people. There's going to be an explosion. We can attempt to tamp down our feelings, but we cannot tamp down our griefs and our sorrows without tamping down everything emotionally. And that can only last for so long. So this is critical stuff that we are talking about. I look for the loss when I'm working with people. I look for the loss in my own life and with family members. What's been lost here? So now we have a new framework before and after COVID. Here we are, smack dab in the middle. I keep hearing people say, we are all in the same boat. Folks, we are not in the same boat. We are in the same pandemic, and it is an ocean called COVID-19. We're in the same ocean, but we are not in the same boat. We are all grieving some sort of loss, but we are not all grieving the same things, and we are not grieving with the same resources. If this is an ocean and we are ministers to folks who are hurting, even within the realm of grief, there is privilege. Because some of us are grieving from the stateroom of the ocean liner. And we have brothers and sisters who, for whatever reasons, are on a life raft. We've got some folks who have no life vest. We have some folks who are in the COVID ocean, and they've got whole families hanging on to them. Responsibilities that are absolutely weighing them down. Some are drowning, some are dying. So we are not all in the same boat with this when we talk about grief in 2020. As Jennifer said, everybody's got different ways of dealing with grief. We all have different losses. For some folks right now, and we can't compare. Let me backtrack on that. It's counterproductive to compare, because when we start comparing grief with grief, somebody's going to come up short. And it just doesn't work. I don't like to do comparisons. I would rather talk about just differences. Differences in the intensity of what's been lost, the duration of the loss. For some folks, this is a blip, a big blip, but a blip. They have the resources to grieve and to manage and not be financially completely destroyed. For others, this is life and death. And then we factor in that along with that, everything else that we were dealing with in life before COVID hit is still happening. It's still there. Losses don't exist in a vacuum by themselves. It's the nature of grief that when another loss arises, that all those other losses that we've had kind of come up. I always think of that scene at the end of, I think it was the first Terminator movie. Do y'all know the one where he's fallen off into this molten something and all these faces and bodies are bubbling up out of that? That's the image I have. You're going to go back and watch that movie, aren't you? That's the image I have, is all the stuff that was kind of under the surface comes bubbling up. So now we are hit with the grief that comes from COVID and all of those other bubbling griefs that we kind of, kind of had tamped down a little bit. I'm especially concerned for folks who are already dealing with addiction, mental illness, family problems, because this has exacerbated what they were already dealing with. It's no wonder that we are reeling right now. The kinds of losses that we're dealing with, like I said, we're dealing with different types of losses. Some of us are dealing with very concrete losses. I mean, when you lost a job, you can look at that and see loss of job, loss of income, loss of health. People who actually have been diagnosed and positive, even loss of life for some of our brothers and sisters as human beings. We can see those. When we can see it, we can kind of wrap our head a little bit around what we might do to help. Then we run into this stickier area of losses that are more ambiguous. We don't live in a culture that's particularly adept at honoring grief in general. You know, Mama dies, be back at work in 3 days. You know, some religious traditions do have some very specific ways of honoring grief that's more satisfying, but in general, you know, our culture, we're so scattered that we don't have particularly satisfying ways of dealing with loss. So we kind of start out not in the greatest place. Then you factor in these ambiguous losses that folks are dealing with. Those are the losses that we can't pinpoint exactly what we've lost. We know we've lost something, but it's so nebulous. That's that thing where hopes, dreams, the way it was supposed to be, we can't get our hands on it. We don't really know what to do with those types of losses, and yet they are very real. The ambiguous losses, because we have a hard time wrapping our head around them, they can complicate and delay the grieving process. It's just like it's hanging out there and we don't know what to do with it. It just continues to hang out there. And we can get caught up in grief that is not resolved. I hate the word closure. My cohort Jennifer is not. I hate the word closure. It's like the door slams and it's over. It's not over. We accommodate. We learn to live with losses. But it's not closed. To me, the word closure does not even honor what we lost. It's like, Sam, thank you, you're over. So, you know, that's my hobby horse there. Connected with ambiguous grief, to me, is griefs that are disenfranchised, and they're kind of mishmashed up together. Disenfranchised griefs are those griefs that society doesn't know how to put markers to. I love what you said, Jennifer, about the funerals and stuff, because I know, you know, some people think they're doing their family a favor if they say, I don't want a funeral, I don't. Absolutely right. It does not have to be anything formal, but we as human beings do need markers. We need ritual. We need that somehow. And, you know, just throw my ashes out in the river doesn't give the survivors a whole lot to work with unless they can build some structure around that. So these disenfranchised griefs that come up with the griefs that are ambiguous, like right now we're dealing with additional family disruption. loss of businesses, loss of income, dreams being put on hold, situations that we thought were stable, finding out that they're not stable, plans for college, plans for retirement, family plans, forced changes, being quarantined, isolated, losing that social interaction that we took for granted. Those are ambiguous in a way, and they're also disenfranchised because we don't have a mechanism in place to particularly honor how to deal with those losses. In fact, I think for some people it's really hard to identify those as losses, which that's what they are. It is a death of something as it existed. And here's another thing. I'm not real fond of this, the new normal. We don't know. It's part of what we're dealing with is this uncertainty. We don't know what things are going to look like. So we've got concrete losses, we've got ambiguous losses, we've got disenfranchised losses, and somewhere in the middle of all of that, we come face to face with dealing with grief about our own mortality and facing our own vulnerability and how we can do that in new ways. We're doing this with loss of support systems that we've had. As important as funeral services, church gatherings, all of these things are, now we're in a place where that's kind of yanked out from under us. I mean, folks have had funerals and people have gotten sick from being present at the funerals. We're having to rethink everything. And how do we do this going forward in a way that gives us what we need to honor grief and also helps us do it in a responsible, safe way? Anger. We're seeing a lot of anger. Lots of anger. What Jennifer mentioned about anger's place in every grief model I've ever seen is that anger is basically a mask. Anger makes us feel powerful. Anger can make us feel loud. Anger is an illusion that we can control some things we can't control. But beneath that are those painful feelings that go to this real sense of loss. When our own feelings of anger are coming up, and when the people around us, we may not, look at our husband and say, "What you mad about, really?" But we may ask it for ourselves. When the children are irritable, they may not know what they're really upset about, but we can ask for ourselves, what is the loss underneath here? In all of this, we are invited to do things different. I spoke yesterday to a dear 90-year-old relative of mine who is living in assisted living and is doing things very differently. And she said, "Well, I'm wearing my phone out." She's doing what she can to stay in touch. And she said, "I'm an optimistic realist. I don't like it. But I don't have to like it." And I was thinking, if we could all get that message. I mean, this precious woman is like, I don't like it, but I don't have to. And that's where we are. We're having to do things that we had no choice about. So the gratitude here is that we have been able to come up with things to do to deal with changes, the birthday party parades, alternate ways of celebrating finishing school, waving outside windows. We don't like it. It's not the same. It's not good enough, but we are coming up with alternatives. Things to be grateful for, that we can come up with ideas for honoring grief and the grief at the same time. They can coexist together. Some of us are grieving, and we're being put in a position of needing to let others help us. That's a tough one because, we generally think about, how do I help? How do I help? We may also need to consider, how do I accept some help here? Because at any given time, we could be the ones on the raft and somebody else could be an ocean liner. We may need some assistance there. Ultimately, it's in times of limitation that human beings are at their most creative. One of my other roles is as an artist. When I get stymied and my creativity is, I can't function, my brain's going in too many different directions. One of the creative techniques we can use is limitation. Limit that color palette. Limit the materials I can use. Creativity comes from that. Artwork was created in Auschwitz. Music was composed in death camps. That's the human nature. That's the human spirit rising up. So we can, out of our limitations, come up with adequate ideas. And basically, what Jennifer said, we carry our grief by sharing our grief, by being fully present for each other. And with that, I'll close. Did we have questions?
I have a few questions, and Mary probably does. So
Would you?
Maybe you could both be off the stand up there.
Yeah, we can kind of.
And then just go up to the podium whenever.
Okay. First question, somebody else.
So the first question I have is for Jennifer. She talks about, it's very practical. You talk about like individual ways of grieving. Some people grieve in different ways. Some ways are more positive for certain people. Some ways are more negative. How do we learn from our perspective which is the best way, most positive way for us as individuals to grieve?
Well, I think a lot of it is honoring what feels right for you. And I use the example of going to the cemetery. If you're drawn to go to the cemetery, and when you get there you feel better, and you realize this fills me up, I feel better here, that's your answer. But if going there is something that makes you nauseous, and the idea of going hurts you, that's your answer. And that's just one example, but like Jaylene was talking about grieving through the pandemic, one thing I found is my sleep schedule has been wildly inappropriate. And obviously when I sleep on a regular schedule, I feel better, but I find myself not doing that for whatever reason. And so if I push myself to do the things that I know make me feel better, as opposed to what happens to come naturally, or what end up being drawn to, and if I do the things I know is going to help me, then I'll have a better outcome.
So just be honest about what makes you feel good.
Right. Even if it's not what's working for somebody else, it doesn't matter.
And abstract grief, is that what you said?
Ambiguous?
Ambiguous grief.
Ambiguous.
Yeah. I see that kind of just in, it seems kind of silly and stuff, but I am a huge sports fan.
Okay.
And that's gone, and that's like, for a lot of people, that gives them joy. And if there's no alternative available, I mean, that seems like kind of a petty form of grief, but not really, because I think it has a huge effect on, especially people in the South, if they lose their college football.
Right.
And that's going to be devastating for people in what seems like a silly way compared to the other kinds of like concrete grief and stuff. But, it's real.
It's real. And what you're saying is exactly the core of how we deal with it is not to minimize it, because it's not silly. I mean, if you look at how many folks, their identity is tied up with their team, and their whole week depends on how they did on Saturday afternoon. You know, I mean, it is, I think it goes to the core of where we don't dismiss another person's grief. It's like what you're talking about styles of grieving, where I don't say, God, so-and-so's lost their job and Tim's worried about, you know, his ball team. That not comparing. That we're being called upon to be, I'm being called upon to be more tolerant and kinder than I thought was in me. You know, because I can be real judgy, you know, especially on things like this. But it is genuine. I mean, and it's acknowledging, if we can acknowledge, yeah, that is very significant. And also how many people are dealing with it. And that, to me, that says a lot. It's not just you, it's a lot of folks. So, yeah.
Well, I was just thinking about when Tim said, you know, those things give him a lot of joy. And I think that's true for lots of people, that there's that aspect that some of those entertainment type things are also a release for us, you know, and
Good point.
think about, okay, what activities am I not getting to do right now that usually help relieve my stress or kind of help me decompress, and I think there's that element to that too.
That's a great point.
I know, like, Susan, you love live music.
Yes, that's the thing I miss most, and it's not coming back anytime soon. It's gonna take a complete wiping out of the virus before people can go to concerts, and you can't safely distance and economically pay the musician.
But it's wonderful that musicians have been able to come up with online concerts and everything, but it's not the same as going to Red Rock, is it? by any means. And it still goes back to the core of recognizing how significant that is to Susan and honoring it. Now, I thought you made a good point, Mary Howard, about the release is, I don't know that we can always just up and create new ways to get that, but if we can open ourselves up to where else might I get some of these needs met. If we're open to it, that sometimes those opportunities sort of present themselves instead of perseverating on this is gone. If we can sort of hold both gently. What do you think, Jennifer?
I agree. I think we have to get creative. Like you said, the having these parameters that box us in make us look for other ways. But I think one thing we're all dealing with, whether it's the loss of our team or live music, we're dealing with the loss of control. Everybody likes to be in control of their own life. And right now, if we're conscientious and respectful of other people and how our actions will affect them, we really have had to give up a lot of control over how we find that release. And that in itself is frustrating. So I think that's a grief that we're all sharing, at least, is learning how to figure out different ways to look at it.
I think a lot of that has to do with the, some of the anti-mask sort of mentality is the loss of control.
Yeah.
Less than, that you can't tell me what to do, but now I feel like I'm not an agent anymore.
Right.
If I have to do this.
Right, because really, wearing the mask itself isn't costing us anything. We're not having, aside from the few dollars we may spend on the mask, we're not having to pay for a privilege or having taken from us except for that for control. We're just, we're having to make a choice that helps someone besides ourselves. And when we feel like we're in control, that may seem like a really easy thing to do. oh, we're going to do this to make everyone else around me safer. But if we feel like things are completely out of control, and that's just one more thing that we don't get to choose.
I think it's interesting because you talk about like the locus of control, and for some people it's wearing a mask, but like for me, it was the food I normally eat and the life I normally lead. And so I've been coping by trying to control other parts of my life that used to weren't important enough to control. So I micromanage those things that fell by the wayside because that gives me some sense of control over something, and that helps you cope with that. Even if you're not, say, anti-mask wearing, you still, I think there's a lot of loss of control and the ability to, I used to go out and eat lunch every single day at work, just drive through. Now that's not like that. And for me, mentally, that took a lot of coping because I was used to devoting zero time to the preparation of a lunch. And now I have to reform my life. So that control extends in so many ways.
I used to drive to work 20 minutes and then 20 minutes home, and in those 20 minutes I had my music that I could listen to. That wasn't Kids Bop. It was it was my choice, and I could sing to it. And now I walk from one room to the next, and I feel like I don't have that decompression time, and so I find that my frustrations get higher, and so I look for other ways to get my free time, which is hard when you're quarantined at home with other people who children don't have the best boundaries. So yeah, trying to find other ways I can control little
It's
things.
interesting about the commute time because my commute just dropped. We moved and it dropped from 30-something minutes to 2 minutes. And so I've noticed that my first hour at work is just chaotic because I don't have that 30 minutes of dropping everything that happened at home and slowly transitioning.
You don't have that decompression
You don't
time.
have that.
Yeah.
I have a question that either one of y'all could answer, or y'all both might want to speak to it. But would y'all talk a little bit about recognizing signs in ourselves that might mean we need to actually go and see a therapist or a counselor, or or what we might see in somebody that we love or a friend, to help recognize they need a little more help than I'm capable of giving them?
For ourselves, I think it's important to do a check-in every so often. With my clients, I tell them, especially if we're not seeing each other as often, check in with yourself a couple times a week. How am I doing? How am I sleeping? How are my emotions? How's my energy? And if we find things are way off track, that may be the time to either do some things ourselves to get back on track, or to give someone a thought. As far as other people, it's hard to suggest to someone if they see a counselor. In our society, that's not always honored. There's a lot of stigma still around mental health, and so suggesting that someone else may need to see someone is not always received well. But it would be the same thing if you see that they're struggling with the basics: sleep, appetite, being able to take care of basic necessities. If their emotions seem to be all over the place. The thing you mentioned about the boiling point of the pressure cooker and the steam hitting innocent people, when we have emotions that the reaction seems very large for something very small, we get kind of raged by something that typically would only make us a little frustrated, or start sobbing over something that normally would have just made us a little upset. That could be a key that there are other things being triggered. That's not just the current. And so when those things start spilling out, that's a good time to have something with them.
Y'all share a little personal blurb here. I had a come apart the other night. It's the first opportunity I'd had to have a come apart in a few days. Several, it's life, Several days had built up. We'd gotten some unexpected news about some major home repairs that were coming, concerns about school starting, first one thing and another. And I've been holding it all together. And finally, one night, there was nobody there, and I started crying. And I could not stop crying. Okay, I'm okay with that, because I was thinking, finally I could cry. So it was not about in that case, the size of my expression. It was what I'd been holding in, and I knew it. If I were still sobbing uncontrollably today from then, yeah, I probably need to connect with somebody. And, another thing, for those of us who have a history of addiction, mental illness, certainly if we find ourselves or somebody we care about moving toward harmful self-harm behaviors, then we need to take some steps to get ourselves some good attention. Now, one thing, I think our local NA group here, one in Corinth, I know went back to meeting face-to-face. But, for folks, face-to-face might be preferable, but there are online options for 12-step recovery programs. That's possible when maybe getting to a therapist doesn't seem, like it's workable. Other questions?
We have an online comment from Beverly. Grief rituals are so necessary, even if it seems weird. I routinely talk to my mother, who has been dead about 25 years. It makes me feel better, and I feel connected to her.
Yeah, exactly what we're talking about.
I think that's great. And that's a great point, because just like, again, going back to the example of the cemetery, I've had friends that said, my mom, she calls her sister's phone and she leaves her messages and she's been dead a year. And I'm like, okay, that's fine. Because that's what makes her feel comfortable and connected. And as long as that's working for her, why stop? It's not hurting anybody. It's not hurting herself. It's not destroying anything. As long as it's working, keep doing it.
Yeah.
So I also have another question. COVID seems to have disproportionately affected, or is disproportionately affecting, communities of color and communities of poor communities, which are the very same groups that don't have much access to mental health care for various reasons. So, if you care to comment.
And you want us to address that? Here's Jennifer. Do you have?
Are there resources for people in North Mississippi, for example? You may not be able to report.
There are some private practices. There's one in Tupelo that we were talking about earlier that is offering some mental health counseling at a lower cost. I'm not sure their options. I know the community mental health centers also are offering, always offer lower cost counseling. I don't know that I really have a good answer. I mean, I can respond to the question, but I'm not sure that I can answer the problem, because when it comes down to it, the state-funded mental health centers are overrun, and that's where you get your lower cost counseling. But they were overrun before COVID, and they're not. I'm sure they don't have any extra resources now. But
the thought that
y'all are here to solve all of the problems.
That wasn't in the contract.
I have a magic wand in my office.
The thing that occurs to me is we certainly as individuals don't know everybody that needs help, who fits into, actually, it's basically disenfranchised groups of people. But if we can reach out in whatever way we can to whoever we know, there's an opportunity for us. And we can't fix it, but even the phone call that says, I'm at the grocery store, do your kids need something? A note in the mail. I mean, what we're saying is I see you. And this is the population that is invisible. So, you know, I don't know that we can hit masses of people at one time, but if we can open our eyes and hearts to whoever's in our community, you know, that one of my concerns is how the stress of all of this is affecting folks who are caught in domestic violence situations. And we can't necessarily safely, if you say you know someone who you're really concerned about, we can't necessarily safely go in and intervene. But I'd love to hear your input on this, but one thing I had thought of is to help de-escalate and keep eyes and ears kind of on those people, because, you know, if there's a perpetrator, the goal is to isolate. Maybe even touching base with the perpetrator, whether we want to or not, and saying, how you doing? Now you got a lot on you. You know, is there anything I can do to help? You know, you got food for your house. You know, if you come in and you try to make connection with the person you think is probably the victim, you're going to get cut off. But if we can make connection with the person who possibly is the perpetrator, I'm thinking we might be able to be of some service there. What do you think on that?
I hadn't really thought of that, but I think it's a good idea, because you're right, you're not going to have access to the victim, or you won't have access for very long. And if we're all isolated right now to an extent, and so this person probably victims of domestic violence, victims of child abuse were already set up in a situation to be isolated. Now they're not. The kids aren't going to school. Teachers aren't seeing the symptoms of abuse. The domestic violence victims aren't going to grocery stores. And there's not those typical ways that got them out of home. So if that's the only way to get in, I feel like there's going to be a lot of people who have increased violence from this, regardless of our intentions. Going back to your other question, though, about the communities, kind of what you were saying before, a system may not be able to solve the problem to the communities of color or the communities that have been disenfranchised. It's going to be individuals reaching out to your neighbor, or I think that's where we're going to probably have better access, is having individuals looking out for other individuals. And I don't know that any system, most of our systems, helping systems, whether it's mental health, domestic violence, addiction services, they were overwhelmed prior to this pandemic. They're really not sustainable to add a whole lot more stress. And so I think it's going to be going back to neighborhoods. And unfortunately, I feel like there's a lot of people that's going to fall through the cracks there. But I think there will be the opportunity for some people to have their eyes open to the strides they can make in their own community.
I think we've been going almost an hour now, so maybe you just end by, if people want to get in contact with you, either to talk personally, or, you know, that kind of thing, like what's, you know, your professional contact information, if you're sharing that.
Okay. You can just reach me by phone at 662-808-0902. And I have a Facebook page called Art of Living 101. You can also reach me there. Jennifer?
I have a Facebook page as well. It's Jennifer K. Wilder, LCSW. And I am in the office of Miller Psychiatry in South Hillo, and that number is 662-869-3042. I think that's